Good morning, friends. My name's Gary Shaw. I'll be your guest preacher this July 3rd. I'm sitting in the administrative office um, here at church, and it's the office that I've been spending most of my time in lately as your interim administrative assistant while Clark is on his leave. This Sunday we have a lesson from 2 Kings, the 5th chapter, verses 1 through 14, and it's the story of a mighty warrior who is struggling to find his health and to be healed from leprosy. And in the lesson, there are 6 or 7 characters, but they can primarily be broken down into 2 categories. There are the powerful, which would include this mighty general, Naaman, and 2 kings, the king of Israel and the king of Aram, which would later become Syria, which would later become the Syrian Empire, which would later become those that conquered Israel and Judah. On the other side, there are these unknowns. There are the lesser thans. There are the others. They are servants and slaves. And in this group is a young Israelite girl who was taken during a war raid, deported to Aram, and became the servant, the slave of Naaman's wife. There's also Elisha, who in this particular scripture could be called the couch prophet. And then there are Naaman's own servants and slaves that accompany him on his trip to the king of Israel. In essence, the healing of Naaman is about entitlement, it's about power, it's about pride, it's about prejudice. And in worship, we're going to look at 3 lessons that the scripture might lead us to. But this morning, I want to move in a different direction. I want us to think about something that we don't talk about much in church, but it is something very, very active and true in our world and in our church. When I was asked to become a district superintendent, the bishop gave me a list of a dozen or so things that I would need to commit myself to in order to serve as district superintendent. And we went down that list one by one, things like, will I uphold the United Methodist discipline? Will I practice spiritual disciplines? Will I practice self-care? And after each question, she would ask for examples, and I would follow up with a story or how I actually practiced these questions in real time and real life. As we reached the end of the list, she said, Gary, will you work toward the elimination of racism and white privilege? And without hesitation, I answered, yes, Bishop, I've already done much of that work. In college, I took courses on institutional and historic racism, and while in seminary, I did a quarter of a pastoral clinical education with the American Friends Service Committee at Massachusetts Correctional Institution in Walpole. My bishop was unfazed. And then she asked, Gary, I want you to think about the church you grew up in and the ones that you've served, and how many people of color have you been a pastor to? People of color. Well, that was a new phrase for me. And I thought to myself, did a quick calculation, and having served 1 town church, 2 suburban churches, 1 urban church, the answer that I sheeplessly gave was 2. I think I'm beginning to see the point, I said. It's my privilege and my entitlement that allows me to say, I've done this, when really it is lifetime work. Sometimes I think the bishop asked me to be a superintendent, not because of the skills and passion that I brought to the office, but because I needed a lot of internal work on race and self and culture. One of the books that the bishop suggested I read is called Enter the River by Jody Shear. And it was in many ways a life-changing book for me. Shear is a Mennonite and uses this passage from 2 Kings as a way for white Christians to enter the conversation of racism and privilege. And he begins by sharing a theory that was developed in the 70s and put forth by sociologist Patricia Badal-Padva that simply states that racism is an equation. Racism equals prejudice plus power. Now, this theory has its supporters and it has its detractors. It's not a perfect definition. It does not span across all systems and institutions. But for me, it hit the mark. It was a non-threatening place for me to enter the river. Now, most people shut down when talking about race because they fear, rightly or wrongly, that they're going to be called a racist. But let's look at this equation. And let's start with prejudice. Prejudice is a preconceived opinion that is not based on reason or actual experience. So if you've never been to England or Scotland, and you say that Scotland is a better place, that's a prejudicial statement. It's not bad, it's not evil. It's a preference, it's an opinion. And there isn't a person in the world who isn't prejudiced. Ford over Chevy, 9 a.m. service over 11 a.m. service, chicken over fish, navy blue over sky blue, Army over Navy, Wahoos over Hokies. You may have never gone to Virginia Tech or the University of Virginia, but my guess is you have an opinion one way or the other, a preference, a prejudice. Power or privilege is a bit trickier. I've known people who live in $4 million homes and have 2 other $1 million vacation homes, and they will tell me straight up that they are not privileged. Even though they don't have anything to worry about outside of sickness and death, they don't even worry about taxes. They would say they had no advantages over anyone else, and they had to bust their you-know-what to get where they are. Shear works to try to dismantle this avoidance, if you will, by noting that power and privilege can be gained, it can be earned, it can be given, it can be stolen, it can be inherited. For example, I have power. I'm educated, I'm white, I'm a male, I'm middle class, I have pension and health care, I own a home. That's just 6 things that I can think of off the top of my head. 6 things that other people don't have. Am I more powerful than Elon Musk or Joe Biden or Donald Trump? No. By most standards, no. Did I have choices? Some. But I did not choose my skin color or my gender. Power is not bad. It's a reality. And what you do with that reality is really what makes the difference. Which takes us back to Scripture. I want you to read that 2 Kings passage and think about the people, and the cultures, and the personal status, and the religions that are all wrapped up in those 14 verses. Who has power? Who doesn't? What kind of prejudices are assumed? What kind are actually voiced? Where do you see yourself in the Scripture? And perhaps in our reactions, or better put, perhaps in our reflections, you may well have some reactions, but perhaps in our reflections, we might enter another river. And that is the river of asking ourselves, what does it mean to affirm? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Take a look at 2 Kings. Take a look at yourself and enter the river of reflection as we seek God's presence this day and forevermore. Thanks be to God. We'll see you on Sunday.